Hello everyone and welcome back to the Airfix YouTube channel. In this video we're going to build and paint the new Airfix starter set of the 1/72nd scale Supermarine Spitfire Mk.Vc. This is an all new starter set designed from the ground up to have a reduced parts count, an easier build sequence, and being a starter set it also includes poly cement, a brush and some acrylic paints to paint the kit. It also comes with a little stand to display your model. The full colour diagrams on the back of the kit box detail how to paint the model using the 4 paints supplied, as well as where to position the markings to represent a Spitfire of the Polish RAF 303 Squadron in Northolt 1942. Inside the box you'll find 3 sprues of light grey injection moulded plastic. These contain all of the kit parts and the included stand. In the smaller bag you'll find 4 Humbrol acrylics and a small tube of poly cement to glue the kit together. There's also the ever-present Humbrol Airfix starter set paintbrush to paint the model. The instruction guide details every step of the assembly process, and it's important that you follow this carefully, as on this model some parts need to remain unglued to allow them to move later on. To put the model together we'll be using the Humbrol Modeller's Toolset, which is a small basic toolkit containing everything you need to get started. It includes a file, tweezers, some cutters and a modelling knife, and should have all the tools you need to get this starter set complete. All of the kit parts are stored on these frames which we sometimes refer to as sprues. These are not only essential to the injection moulding process, but they also help us to identify the individual parts in the instruction booklet, because each frame has its own letter moulded into the long rectangular tab. Each part has its own number, which is moulded into a small square tab near the parts themselves. This combination of frame letter and part number is called out in the small circular details in the instruction booklet. In this video we're not going to be using any of the Humbrol surface primer that we've used previously, so what we're going to do before we start modelling, whilst everything's held securely on the sprue, is to give all of the parts a wash with soapy water and a scrub with a soft bristle paintbrush before allowing them to dry. This just removes any potential contaminants from the surface of the plastic and gives us the best possible start without using any primer. With everything washed and dried, we can start some modelling now, and the first thing we're going to do is paint the inside of the cockpit, as access will be a bit restricted here once the 2 halves of the fuselage are glued together. We'll be using the number 30 paint from the kit, and before we use it we're going to give it a good stir, as this may have been sat on the shelf for some time before it reaches the bench. With the paint nice and smooth we can transfer a small amount into our palette and then use ordinary tap water to dilute it. We're adding about 40% water to our mixture, and this will increase the drying time of the paint, which gives it time to settle down on the surface of the model, and it also prevents any 3-dimensional texture from forming in the paint finish. Because we're using a water-based acrylic straight onto bare plastic, there may be some instances where surface tension prevents the mixture from sticking. That's why we're using short, fast strokes of the brush repeatedly over the same areas, just to break that surface tension and get an initial coat of paint down on the model. Making sure to get into all of the tight corners by turning the pieces around as we paint, we can quickly have our initial coat down on the model and then set this aside to dry while we work on a different area. Because the cockpit floor will be visible through the canopy, we're giving this area of the lower part of the plane a quick coat of the same green paint. We're using the same technique to overcome any surface tension issues. The only part that we're not painting is the top of the seat mount, as we need to apply glue to this area later on. With the first coat of paint fully dry, we're going to go ahead now and apply a second coat to all of the painted areas, just to solidify the paint coverage and make sure that there aren't any areas where we've allowed bare plastic to show through. Once this is applied, we're going to set this aside to dry fully, and then we can commence with the actual build of the aircraft. To remove the parts from the sprue, we need to cut through these slightly thinner pieces of the frame, and we're going to do that using the cutters from the Humbrol toolset. We're not going to place the cutters right up against the actual model parts themselves, as this risks damaging the surface detail. Instead, we're going to move just a slight distance away and then make the cut and leave a small piece of plastic protruding from the surface of the model. This little bit of excess plastic will need to be trimmed away, but we can do this easily using the model knife. By placing the side of the blade along the fuselage and then using this as a guide to push the cut downwards into the cutting mat, we can trim away the excess plastic without risking damage to the surface of the model. To glue the model together, we're provided with a small tube of Humbrol polycement, which doesn't work like a conventional adhesive, but rather melts the plastic so that when the two pieces are pressed together, it forms a permanent bond. The polycement is supplied in a tube with quite a large nozzle, so this can make it difficult to control the bead if you're applying the glue straight from the tube. To give ourselves a bit more control over the polycement, we can take our modelling knife and cut a corner from the starter set box to create an applicator, and then cut away one of the small sides of the box lid to create a pallet. We now have somewhere where we can place the polycement first, before using the applicator to transfer the cement from the pallet to the model. This gives us far more control over the polycement. We can now use the applicator to start building up a bead of glue along the mating surfaces of the fuselage. These are coloured yellow in the instructions, and we're going to concentrate the glue in these areas along the inside face of the model. When the two halves of the fuselage are squeezed together, this should prevent any of the glue bubbling out onto the detailed surface, and this also reduces the risk of getting the glue onto your fingers and thus causing fingerprints on your model. With a bead of glue applied to all of the necessary surfaces, the two halves of the fuselage were pressed together and just need to be held in place while the polycement dries. To help with this, you can use an ordinary clothes peg and place it on the model to just keep everything still while the glue does its work. Once the polycement is set, we can now finish the cleanup of the sprue connection points. We're going to use the file from the Humbrol toolset and gently and gradually remove that excess plastic which was left over from the cleanup with the model knife. If you've watched any of our previous starter set videos, you'll notice that we normally do this kind of cleanup before the parts are glued together. However, by waiting until after the fuselage is joined, we don't risk sanding away any of the mating surface, leaving gaps in the join between our two halves of the plane. We can now move on to the front end of the fuselage and apply the cowling, which only needs to be glued at the cockpit side, leaving the front end free so the propeller can spin on the finished model. A small amount of polycement is applied to the locations shown in the instructions, and then the cowling and exhaust piece is pressed into place and held firmly, ensuring there are no gaps between this part and the rest of the fuselage. Another bead of polycement is required along the inside of the lower wing assembly. Again, we're using the applicator to concentrate the glue towards the inside of the aircraft so that when the upper portion of the wing is pressed into position, the polycement doesn't bubble out onto the detailed surface and avoids the risk of getting any fingerprints on the wings. Once that upper portion of wing is pressed into place, we can bring out the clothes pegs again to just hold them while the polycement dries. The whole process is repeated on the opposite side of the model, only this time while we're waiting for the polycement to dry on the wings, we can go ahead and glue the seat into position. This will just need painting, and then we can attach the wings to the fuselage, and this model should start to look much more like a Spitfire. We used the same process on the seat as we did with the cockpit, diluting the green paint with about 40% tap water and giving it a couple of light coats, allowing it to dry fully in between applications. While the paint was drying on the seat, we moved on to assembling the tail section and getting this glued onto the fuselage portion of the model. The parts were snipped from the sprue with the cutters, any excess was trimmed away with the modelling knife, and then unlike the fuselage, we filed away any remaining plastic before the parts were glued into position. After filing away the small stubs left behind from the sprue connections, these were pushed into position with a bit of polycement in the housing which is moulded into the rear of the fuselage. After pressing the parts into position, these just needed to be checked quickly to make sure they were aligned properly and everything was nice and straight. Once everything had been allowed to dry and cure properly, we applied another bead of glue along the lower portion of the wing root and around the areas of the fuselage coloured yellow in the instructions, before carefully placing the two halves of the aircraft together and pushing them into position. At this point we can start to see the iconic lines of the Spitfire emerging from the pieces that we've been assembling, and again we have another excuse to bring out those legendary clothes pegs, as they hold everything together, allowing the polycement to dry fully before we proceed on to the next steps of the build. With the main body of the Spitfire glued together, it was time to add the detail parts to the underside of the wings. Using the techniques that we've already covered in this video, these parts were removed from the sprue with the cutters, cleaned up with the knife and file, and then glued into position with a bit of polycement. There are recesses on the underside of the wings to enable quick and accurate positioning of these parts, so the assembly of this sequence was very fast and very simple. When we reached the landing gear parts, we had a decision to make whether to model this aircraft in flight or on the ground with the landing gear down. We elected to go with an in-flight model, so we used the parts B15 and B14. If you do want to model it with the landing gear down, there's a full set of parts for this included with the kit. Before we went ahead and glued the in-flight landing gear in position, we painted the wheel wells with a bit of the black paint included with the kit, after diluting it with a bit of tap water, just to make sure that no bare plastic would be visible once the retracted landing gear was glued into position. Once the paint was dry, a bit of polycement was added to the pegs on the undercarriage, and then these parts were dropped into position and just carefully adjusted to make sure that they sat flush with the rest of the wing. Moving back round to the upper side of the aircraft, a bit of polycement was added in the recess behind the cockpit, and the antenna was dropped into place carefully, trying to avoid allowing any of the polycement bubbling up, as this is a very visible area of the model. When gluing the propeller into position, we had to apply the polycement carefully to make sure that none of the glue got behind the propeller assembly, and glued the free rotating nose section in position, as we wanted to be able to turn the propeller once the model was finished. With all of the exterior parts glued onto the model, all that remains to add is the pilot figure and the canopy, which will glue into place once the aircraft's been painted. Let's get started with the painting process, and we have these three colours for the exterior of the aircraft. The green is for the camouflage scheme and the darker grey is for the upper portion of the aircraft, and it's much easier to paint a dark colour over a lighter colour such as the underside's grey, number 64, so we'll start with this colour first. Rather than trying to obtain coverage over a dark colour using the lighter grey, it will be easier to start with the lightest colour first and then work our way down. A little bit of the number 64 is added to our palette after being given a good stir, and then again ordinary tap water is added to a ratio of about 40 to 50% to make sure that this goes down as smoothly as possible and doesn't leave any three-dimensional texture in our paintwork. Using the brush supplied with the starter set, we can apply our initial coat of paint to the underside of the Spitfire. We're working in single direction wherever possible, and we're using short, sharp strokes of the brush to try and overcome any surface tension issues that we might encounter. Even though we've washed the parts in soapy water, we're painting directly onto bare plastic with water-based paint, so it's not always going to behave the way we want it to. By using these short, fast strokes of the brush, we can force the paint to settle down on any stubborn areas and get our initial paint layer down. We're not worried too much at this point about the solidity of the paint coverage, but rather we just want to get one smooth coat of paint down and allow it to self-level on the surface, as this is almost going to act as our primer. Once that first coat of paint is completely dry, we can go ahead and apply our second coat. Because we're no longer painting over bare plastic, colour coverage will be much easier to achieve with this second application, and we can go ahead and blast this over the entire underside of the model, covering up any areas where our initial coat was a little bit streaky, and ensuring that we've got good coverage across the entire portion of the underside of the model. Don't forget to also paint inside the nooks and crannies on those details on the wings, as these will be visible when the model's completed. With the underside of the Spitfire completely painted and allowed to dry, we mounted the model on a piece of old paintbrush handle, just so we could hold it safely without risking getting any fingerprints in our paintwork. Now it was time to move on to the upper half of the aircraft, so we transferred some of the dark grey into our palette, and yet again we diluted it to about 40 to 50% using ordinary tap water. We started off by applying the dark grey along the demarcation line where the two different colours meet. This is shown in the coloured diagrams on the back of the kit box, and we wanted this line to be as neat as possible, so we used small, smooth movements of the brush. By keeping the brush strokes small, any mistakes that might be made will be small as well and easier to fix. Because we'd painted over this area with the light grey when we were painting the underside of the model, this also helped to work as a primer, so it was much easier to obtain a nice coverage in this area without having to do it multiple times. Once we'd painted in the demarcation line, we could move out towards the rest of the aircraft, and we did run into some surface tension issues on the bare plastic, but we overcame these in the usual way by using short fast strokes of the brush just to break the surface tension and get that initial coat of paint down. Again, we don't need to worry about colour coverage, as we just want this initial coat to work almost as our primer. Once that initial coat of dark grey paint is dry, we can only describe the model at this point as a streaky, horrible mess, but we need to trust in the process and go ahead and apply a second coat of that diluted dark grey paint. Just like on the underside of the model, because we're no longer painting over bare plastic, the colour starts to build up much quicker this time and look much more solid, and we can go ahead and paint the entire model, working our way back towards those demarcation lines where the dark grey meets with the light grey on the underside. When we reach this point, we need to slow down and work very slowly and gradually towards that demarcation line and those panel lines which denote where the colour changes. We'll use small, smooth strokes of the brush again, just to minimise any potential mistakes should we slip up at this point, and just get the second coat of paint pushed right up to that point where the two colours meet. Once the second coat of paint has been allowed to dry fully, we can go ahead and apply a third and final coat just to really solidify the colour and make sure that there are no streaks of that light grey plastic underneath showing through. Because of all the extra tap water that we added to the paint, there should be no three-dimensional texture and no risk of obscuring any of the surface details. We can just add a nice smooth even coat of paint all over and then allow it to dry fully before moving on to the camouflage scheme. Here you can see the completed dark grey base coat and just how smooth everything's gone down, leaving a lovely finish over the top of which we can paint our camouflage. There are a few areas where the dark grey has encroached onto the light grey, so we'll touch those up later on once we've finished painting the camouflage, but overall we're really pleased so far, so we can move on to applying the final colour, the dark green. Using the diagrams on the back of the box and the panel lines as a reference point, we're going to try and sketch in the outline of the camouflage scheme first, before filling this in with a solid layer of green. After thinning the dark green paint with about 40% tap water yet again, we started to outline the rough shape of our camouflage scheme by referencing the panel lines on the surface of the model against the lines shown on the diagram on the back of the box. Just like when we painted the line between the two different greys, we used small strokes to make sure that we could only make small mistakes, and we worked on a section of the model at a time until we got a rough outline completed, when this was blocked in completely with the diluted green paint. The camouflage scheme does go all the way down to the underside of the aircraft, so we just had to take a bit of extra care in these areas and build up the paint gradually to get a nice sharp line between the two different colours. We repeated the process across the rest of the model, outlining the camouflage and then blocking in the inside with 2 coats of the green to make sure that everything was coloured nice and solid and we didn't have any streaky paint in the camouflage finish. Once that was dry, we mixed up some more of the light grey and touched in those areas that we mentioned earlier to give a nice sharp line between the underside of the aircraft and the camouflage on the top. With all of the base coats and camouflage completed, all that remained was to block in the last details with the black paint supplied with the kit. We only wanted to apply a maximum of 2 coats of paint on these parts, so we diluted the black with just 30% tap water this time, simply because the more times we had to repeat this process, the more risk there was of making a mistake. The black paint is obviously the darkest colour in the kit, so we didn't want to get this onto any of the other colours on the model, as it would be tricky to cover up. We worked our way from the outside of the parts towards the rest of the model and then finished them off with as neat a line as possible, taking great care not to get any of the black paint anywhere else. The last detail to paint is the pilot figure, and in the instructions this is shown as being all green. We decided to do something slightly different and gave the uniform and flying gear a coat of the dark grey from the exterior of the Spitfire and painted in the face using the light grey from the underside of the model. Once this was dry, we took some of the black paint from the kit and added about 90% tap water to create a wash. This will settle in all of the recessed details on the dried paint and just enhance the detail slightly, darkening the paint in these areas. Once the wash was allowed to dry fully, we took some of the light grey again, loaded the brush, and then wiped most of it away on a piece of tissue. The brush was then dragged gently over the pilot figure, allowing the light grey to build up on the raised details. This just made all of the detail on the figure stand out that little bit more, using only the contents of the kit. A little bit of polycement was then added very carefully to the pilot's seat, just dabbing it in gently, making sure not to catch the sides of the cockpit or anywhere else on the exterior of the model, and then the pilot figure was gently guided into position and then held in place with the back end of the paintbrush just until the polycement took hold and the pilot was held in position. The final piece of the model to go on is the cockpit canopy. We removed this from the frame, but this time we cut well back from the part, allowing a good chunk of the frame to remain attached to serve as a handle. This was used to hold the part while we painted the cockpit's frame using the dark green paint, which had been diluted with tap water by just 10%. This is simply because this is the trickiest part of the entire paint job, and we wanted to get it done with as few passes of the brush as possible. By having a good strong concentration of paint, we were able to use the tip and sides of the brush to just catch those raised details of the canopy's frame and transfer a strong coverage of paint nice and quickly. There's no shortcuts or easy way to do this, we just need to have a bit of patience and take our time, working our way from the centre of the frame towards the outside, building up the paint gradually until the whole of the frame is covered. Once the paint on the frame is dry, we can snip away that piece of frame we've been using as a handle and add some polycement into the locating hole behind the pilot. The locating tab of the cockpit is then pushed into position, and with a bit of downward pressure, the cockpit snaps into place and the actual assembly of the Spitfire is completed. With everything in position, we can now get started with applying the markings and complete the model. Marking positions are shown on the diagram with these boxes, and the numbers correspond to the markings on the sheet, so we know which one goes where. After selecting the correct marking for our location, these don't peel away like stickers, so we need to cut the marking from the sheet with the modelling knife, and then hold it in tweezers and immerse it in ordinary water for just a few seconds. The water will soak into the transfer paper, reactivating the adhesive and allowing it to slide free. Some more water is then added to the surface of the model to help with final positioning, and then the transfer can be slid half off the transfer paper, moved into position and pinned with the paintbrush, and then the paper pulled away to allow the marking to settle on the surface. The paintbrush can then be used to push this around in that water that we applied, using the panel lines on the model and the diagram to help us reference the location and get it into the correct place. Once it's in the right place, a small bit of tissue can then be used to remove the excess moisture, and the marking application is complete. The large markings containing the roundels and lettering really do bring the model to life, so this is one of the most rewarding parts of the build. These larger transfers can be a bit trickier to move, so after getting them into position, just squeegee them down with the paintbrush to remove any bubbles or wrinkles, before soaking away the extra water with a bit of tissue to get them to settle down nice and smooth. If your markings really don't want to move on the surface, you can use the back of the modelling knife to get them in position. Just be careful not to split the markings or scratch the paint. The stand supplied in the kit comprises of just two pieces. We've assembled ours and painted it with a few coats of the black paint supplied with the starter set. After everything's allowed to dry, we can then pop the stand into the mounting hole on the underside of the aircraft, and the Spitfire starter set is complete. We'd like to thank you all for joining us for some modelling today, as we've been working on something perhaps more synonymous with the hobby of scale modelling than anything else in the world, the humble 1/72nd scale Spitfire. There's just something about this subject which seems to make people want to try out the hobby of scale modelling. So by creating this starter set from the ground up to be as quick and easy as possible to build, we hope that we've provided an excellent gateway into this fascinating hobby, and that by providing this video, we're able to give some advice and inspiration to help you get started along the way. We'd like to thank you all very much for watching, and we'll see you again in the near future for more videos of this type. So as always, thank you very much, and we'll see you again next time.